Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, doing the final video on our Musical Paradise MP301 Mark III version 2. And we showed how to mod this thing. We've gone over the circuit changes, how to draw load lines, blah, 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 blah. Let's do the final little step, which is listening impressions, tube rolling, and then the final tests on our Analog Discovery 2 with the tubes that sounded the best to me. And I'm hoping that the objective testing shows what my subjective thoughts are. And I'm going to go ahead and give you my subjective thoughts first. And I tried it with some RP600M speakers. And people say, oh, yours are modified. They've had one brand of cap changed inside them, which made like that much difference. So these aren't like some crazy re-crossovered speakers. They've just been breathed on. So they're basically RP600M Mark 1s. And then on the tubes, I've tried KT88s, KT77s, 6CA7s, Electro-Harmonics, Gold Lion, whole slew to have some of the, Shuggy Treasure tubes. I got just a mess of tubes that'll plug into this amp. And the two I settled on, which you guys that follow my channel won't be surprised, I really like the way the JJ EL34Ls sound in this amp. They're nice and smooth, especially with those RP600M speakers. And I'm talking about at 80 to 85 dB listening levels. We're not talking about, down at 60 or 70, super low volume. I call room filling sound. Those really sound nice, and they're a nice balance between being like overly bright or being too mellow. And so if you haven't tried a pair of those in this amp, give those a try. They're cheap. I think they're $23 a piece or $24 a piece or something like that. Well worth giving a shot in this amp. To me, they're one of the best sounding EL34 tubes around. And that's even comparing it to some Mullards and some of those Matsuma made in Japan ones that are made on the, the Mullard tooling or whatever. So, yeah, give those a try. The other tubes that I liked, especially with headphones, I got some Sennheiser HD600s. And I know some of y'all are like, oh, those are cheap headphones. Well, they're not. They cost as much as this amp did. And I can't imagine people are using $3,000 headphones to listen to a $300 tube amp. So I felt like they're kind of in the right price range to be using what a lot of people might use. And for that use, especially given that you're using a lower position on the volume control, it's over here, not there, these new Horizon EL34 ATs sounded really nice. They kind of brought up the high end and the clarity a little bit that I wasn't getting with the JJ tubes. And these actually work good with speakers too. They're just maybe a little less mellow. Nice to have a combination of both depending on the source and the mastering. So yeah, with two pairs of those tubes, I think you can kind of cover the whole spectrum of uses. On the driver tubes, these Sylvania 6SJ7s had a nice smoothness to them, kind of rolled down or tamped down the high end a little bit, which we saw in testing that the high end or the high frequency response was a little on the high side, maybe a half a dB. And so I feel like that kind of tones that down and gets the amp sounding more neutral. And again, I tried about a half a dozen different, 6SJ7s and these Sylvania solid plate ones with the little ribs in the plate, to me, sounded the best. The mesh plate tubes were, to me, too mushy. And I tried a couple other variants of the SD something. I'll put it up here. They sound horrible. And like, there's a whole bunch of tubes they say you can use in this front end. The way this amp's been modded, it's been modded to use a 6SJ7. I'm sure those other tubes will still work, but yeah, just use these. I will say though, with headphones, these RCA red, what are these things, 5693s, had a nice little top end sparkle that my headphones needed, which these don't have. And especially given that, again, you're using a lower portion of the gain, these kind of bring up the top end. And so, you know, for tubes, you could have two EL34s, two different driver tubes, and cover kind of the whole spectrum of stuff. The other thing I wanted to note about these Horizon tubes is if you're concerned about the tiny bit of hum that's left, and I mean, we dropped the noise floor by a monster amount doing these mods. That constant hum that this thing had before out of the speakers, or especially with headphones, is gone. It's not there. Little breath of it you can hear with the JJ tubes. With the Horizon tubes, the amp is dead silent. And that's one of the things they talked about with these tubes is the heater construction. And I'm learning that the way the heaters in these indirectly heated cathode tubes are made, there can be leakage between the heater winding and the cathode that you then pick up as hum. And I've seen that in these phono preamps. Some tubes will hum, even with the same brand, and especially this front position. Some tubes will hum, some won't. I can have one of these that's got some pretty bad hum and move the tubes around and it goes away. So if you need silence, and that's something that just bugs you, even with an unmodified one of these, try some of these Horizon tubes, and that may resolve the issue. So, that's my subjective stuff. Let's hook this thing back up to the Analog Discovery 2, do a final pull on it, and I'll try to pull up some graphs from like pre-modified with the stock tubes, or maybe with the EH6CA7s, which the owner of this amp told me were his favorites, and then what we got in the final modded version. So let's put this thing on our Analog Discovery 2. I'm not going to do quite as detailed a review of these test screens as I've done in the past, because we've got quite a few sets of tubes that I would like to show the results of. This is one that I really like the sound of. It was some JJ EL34Ls with the Sylvania 6SJ7 solid plate or ribbed plate tubes, and as you can see, got really low distortion. 1 watt, we've got 0.75%. We got 2 watts at 1%, and then we've got 4 watts at 2%, which is the range that I'm really considering this amp is usable in, is this area right in here. But we've got this headroom here that, you know, up to 6 watts, it's just a little over 3% distortion. So if we have some transients, you don't have to worry about them just getting totally destroyed distortion-wise or getting clipped. As long as you're playing in this 2 to 4 watt range, this is going to sound really nice, and it's going to have the nice even order harmonic distortion that we value from tube amps. Now the frequency response, this is again with the factory transformers. With this tube set, see it's got a little bit of top end brightness here. It's about a, about a half a dB off at 100 hertz, and here at 40 hertz, where most bookshelf speakers roll off, we're down 1.5 dBs. and the 3 dB roll-off point is down here at 20 hertz. So from 40 hertz to 100, going to have about a dB of roll-off, and then from 100 hertz up, it's relatively flat. And you can see even up here on the top end, we got good high-end extension, about a half a dB off on the top end as well, which in this range here, not a lot of music, a lot of people can't even hear in this range, so this doesn't bother me as much as this down here does. But hey, it is what it is. We already kind of went through that with the output transformers. So the next thing I want to do is see if we see any difference with these little red metal RCA driver tubes with these same JJ-EL34Ls. So I'm swapping them in right now in case you hear a little noise in the background. And we're going to power this thing up, give it a minute to warm up, and then do a couple of pulls on it and see what these do. And I am planning on running these 2 pairs of driver tubes, and then we'll start swapping in output tubes. I want to see what these Horizon EL34-ATs sound like, or look like on the screen. I know what they sound like. I will say with headphones, they were my favorite. They were a little quieter than the JJ tubes. While the JJ tubes don't have a lot of noise, the Horizon tubes were dead silent. So for you headphone folks, that may be what you want to use, since we're using a lower portion of the volume scale when we're driving headphones with this amp. So let's go ahead and do a power pull here and see what these little red RCA tubes perform like. And it looks like a very similar slope to what we were seeing with the Sylvania tube. And actually it looks almost dead identical. Got maybe just a breath lower distortion here at 1 watt. Here at 4 watts, just under 2% distortion. And then again at 6 watts, we got 3.3% distortion. The distortion versus power number looks identical with these RCA tubes versus those Sylvanias. So not any different there. But let's see if we see anything on the frequency response. Now these tubes sounded brighter to me, but I'm not sure we're going to see that subtle difference on the Analog Discovery 2. Looks like a very similar curve. We look at the number on the top of the screen on the left. We got 0.16 dB here on the top end. And then at 100 hertz, looks like a little bit less roll off on the bottom end. At 40 hertz, it's more like about 1.2 dB roll off at 40 hertz. So about 2.8 dB roll off down here. So maybe a little more bass response out of this tube. And on the very top end, we've got a slight bit less roll off. So the little RCA tubes on the Analog Discovery 2 are showing a little flatter frequency response than we saw with the Sylvania tubes, but they're all but identical in the way they're measuring here on this equipment that I'm using. And again, had some folks argue in the comments in the past saying, well, if you can't see it and you hear it, then what use is this stuff? Well, you hear the big things, but these little subtle nuances that you hear when you roll tubes, you're not going to see on something like this Analog Discovery 2, because for one thing, we're taking fairly crude steps, and they're also doing a lot of averaging to keep this line smooth. I mean, obviously the actual frequency response is going to be more jagged looking than this. So we can overlay the two in the video like this. Here's the Sylvania tube. Here's the RCA tube. And yeah, you're not going to see the subtle nuances that I heard listening to the tubes, But that's why there are subjective reviews and then there's objective testing. So the other tubes that I want to put in next are going to be the Horizon EL34-ATs, and let's see how they measure. I honestly don't see the value in swapping the input tubes with every pair of output tubes we use since they measured so closely. So I'm just going to leave these little red RCAs in the amp, and let's see what kind of distortion versus power numbers we get from these Horizon tubes. I'm seeing even lower distortion numbers using these Horizon tubes. That's a pretty amazing performance. It does have a little steeper slope in this range here, but as you can see, at 1 watt, you've got 0.25% of THD. At 2 watts, we've got 0.5%. Doesn't cross 1% distortion until 3 watts. So we picked up a whole watt of power before we cross 1%. But then at 4 watts, we're at 1 3/4. So we're starting to catch back up here on the top end. But again, if you're listening in this range here, it's going to sound really nice. It looks like here at 6 watts, may have a breath more distortion on the very top end of the power range than we saw with the JJ tubes, but in the listening area right in here, you're going to have a little less distortion. And that's what I heard listening to these tubes, is they sound a little cleaner, a little crisper, a little more detailed, but they also were maybe a little less smooth. So let's see what we see with the frequency response with these output tubes. Basically seeing the same curve shape. So if we look up here at the peak, we've got -1 dB is kind of the high point. So we go down to 100 hertz. We've lost 0.5 dB. At 40 hertz, we're down 1.5, 1.4 dBs. And then at 20 hertz, we're down the same 3 dBs that we were earlier. And got the same thing on the top end. We're down about 1/4 dB at 20K. So the frequency response curves look the same with all of these tubes, but then when we look at the THD versus power, you definitely got a little less distortion here with the Horizon EL34-AT tubes. So any of these would be good options to use in this amp. Now, one thing people keep asking about is, can I use KT88 tubes in this amp? And historically, I've advised against using high power tubes in an amp designed to use lower power tubes, because you're running it at a lower percentage of its dissipation. And from my experience, the performance suffers. But I want to toss a pair of these Horizon KT88 tubes in this amp and just see how they perform. Now, these were some of my favorites in the Wilsonton R8. I know these are good performing tubes, and I am curious first to dispel the idea that the amp's going to have more power just by putting KT88 tubes in it. And let's look at what that does to the THD versus power and also to the frequency response. So dropping a pair of these tubes into this amp and let these guys warm up. Also, the KT88 tubes have hotter filaments, so it's going to put more heat into the room because the heaters draw more current. It's going to make the power transformer run hotter, and I'm pretty sure we're not going to see any change in the power output. But that's why we do objective testing, so we can see what the real truth is. And as we're letting these warm up, I can see why people looking at this would be impressed or think, ooh, that looks like that's going to be better because look, they're bigger. And so I actually listened to these, and to me, they just did not sound as good as the EL34 tubes did in this amp, but haven't run this test with KT88 tubes yet to see exactly what we get or lose doing this. So here we go. And remember, this is the same brand and construction as the Horizon tubes were that we just tested. And 1 watt, we've got about 0.5% more distortion. If you remember before, it didn't cross 1% distortion till we hit 3 watts, and now we've got almost 2% distortion at the same place. It got this weird little flat thing where it stays at 2% distortion, but then at 6% distortion it just climbs like a rocket, which I'm sure is where it starts clipping. So as you can see, amp didn't gain any power. In these lower regions, you're getting more distortion than you did with the same brand of tube in an EL34. Might have a little less distortion in this 4 to 5 watt range where it kind of flatlines here, but then again it starts clipping at the same point, the 6 watts. So KT88 tubes are not going to give you any more power. Because the tube's running under its rated spec, you're seeing this higher distortion in this range here. And for these reasons, there's no point in running KT88 tubes in this amp. You're going to get a better sound, you're going to have less distortion, and less heat, and less wear and tear and strain on the power transformer. So just from looking at this graph here, if I had to choose between the KT88 and the EL34s in the Horizon line, you can see all you're getting is more distortion. And I've tested these tubes versus the other KT88 tubes, and I'm seeing the same pattern, that you just get more distortion and you're not gaining anything other than the increased heat that these tubes put out and more strain on the transformer windings and making the transformer run hotter. So let's look at the frequency response curve real quick. And I think we're going to see that we have reduced low frequency response using these bigger tubes. You can see we're at 0.15 dB here at the peak. We get down to 100 hertz. We're down 0.5 dB. We're down at 40 hertz. We're down 1.8 dB. So we've lost 0.3 of a dB of low frequency response. And then the 3 dB roll off, actually, because that's 0.15, the 3 dB roll off is now at right at 30 hertz instead of 20 hertz. And at 20 hertz, we're now down almost 5 dBs. So going to these larger tubes, which is probably the opposite of what you would think. Just looking at them, you would think, ooh, there's going to be more bass out of these big tubes. You actually get less bass going with a KT88 tube than you will running an optimized, biased EL34 tube. So, again, I highly discourage people from using KT88 tubes in this amp. They just don't make sense. I mean, I guess, again, if you want to show off to your friends and say, hey, look at these big bottle tubes I got in my little amp, yeah, maybe that's a reason to do it, but for sonic reasons, they perform worse than the EL34s do. Okay, here's another tube, and this was the tube that the owner of this amp said he thought was the best sounding tube. And I'm not sure what other tubes he's tried, but it's an Electro-Harmonix 6CA7. And as you can see, this tube has pretty much a lot worse distortion versus power. We cross 1% at 1 watt instead of 2. We're close to 2% distortion at 3 watts instead of at 4 watts. And at the same 4 watt level, we've got 2.25%. And then at 6 watts, we're at the same 3.3% distortion. So this tube definitely has a lot higher distortion than the EL34 tubes that we tried. And yeah, it sounds okay, but it definitely was not my favorite. And then when we come over here to the frequency response thing, we've got right at 0.2 dBs right along in this range here. And you can see here at 100 hertz, we're down the same half a dB. At 40 hertz, we're down about 1 dB. So we've got a little less low frequency roll off with these tubes. And again, we're right at 3 dBs at 20 hertz. And so in this 40 hertz range, it picks up a little bit of bass response, but it's pretty similar looking curve here. So I think that kind of covers what I wanted to do in this final segment. And again, I feel like for use with speakers, those Sylvania tubes sound really nice. If you need a little more brightness or clarity, the little red bottle metal RCAs sound really good. And the Horizon tubes really depends on your speakers. The Horizon tubes have a little less noise than the JJs do, and I'm talking just a little, and the noise that I'm hearing is with your ear up to the speaker, not from the listening position like it was before. We fixed that by rewiring the front end. For headphone use, I think the Horizon tubes were better. They had a little more clarity, and they're quieter. And in that situation, you could swap between these RCAs and the Sylvanias to kind of tweak the tone a little bit to the mastering of the music you're listening to or your preference. So anyway, I think this is a good place to wrap up this video, this series, box this amp up and get it back to its owner. Let's wrap this thing up. Well, I'm not surprised with what we saw in the Analog Discovery 2. I knew these changes made a huge difference in this amplifier. And yeah, it's kind of hard to see some of this really minor tube rolling stuff as far as the frequency response. But we did gain a ton on the bottom end, which is what this amp was missing. And that was the two goals I had when I started out with this thing, was lower the noise floor, more low end frequency response. And we were able to get those without having to replace the iron or any really expensive components. You should be able to do these mods for under $100 in parts. And then with less than, I would even say, maybe $100 worth of tubes, you can replicate what I've done here and turn this into what I would say is a decent sounding amp. I'm still not going to say it sounds great. I think my 6LU7 amp sounded better than this. It was actually probably a smaller footprint. But again, it was more expensive. And yeah, if you already own one of these and it's not your main amp, you're just trying to improve the sound and you finding the same things I did, that it's got the noise floors too high and it doesn't seem to have good frequency response, yeah, jump in and do this. And it's a good first project. It's not hard to do. Don't be intimidated that you have to cut one circuit trace. That's not a big deal. And it really turned out pretty decent, especially with these Horizon tubes and these Sylvania front end tubes, or these little red RCAs. Yeah, that's a good mix. And if you're looking for something a little more mellow, those JJ EL34Ls are always a great sounding tube in an EL34 amp. So anyway, time to wrap this thing up, get this thing boxed up, send it back to the owner. I'll put a link to his channel below, and maybe in a future Monday monologue, I will link his review of the skunky modded version of this versus his stock one, and see what he has to say about it. I'll be shocked if he isn't as impressed as I am. So again, thanks to you Patreon supporters, thanks for you loyal viewers, subscribers. Really appreciate you guys. If you found this useful, or you want to do this and said, hey, this really helped me out, how can I help Skunky out? I've got a donation page on my website. I'll put a link below. Help me pay for the parts that I've tossed into this thing, because I try to do this with as little cost to the owner as possible, so that'll help me out, reimburse me for some of the wasted money I spent on this thing, like learning, do not buy those Edcor output transformers. That is not an upgrade. So you get to learn from my mistake. So again, hope you're enjoying my channel, and until the next video series, have a nice day.